Good morning, gentlemen, and welcome back to our discussion of consecrated life. One of the things that I've been mentioning is how, as part of priestly life and as part of religious life in general, that there is a form of prayer called the Liturgy of the Hours, or also known as the Divine Office or the Breviary, a set of psalms that are structured throughout the day. So you pray them about 5 times a day. And the idea being that every 4 weeks you've prayed through all of the Psalms. Well, one of those times of a day, the very first time, the office of readings, also known as matins, you not only pray 3 Psalms, but then there's a longer biblical reading and then a decent length non-biblical reading, usually from one of the church fathers, one of the early Christians who we've been talking about, sometimes even from one of the desert fathers that we've been discussing. Today had a very interesting reading from Saint Gaudentius of Brescia. He became the Bishop of Brescia in 387. And he has this to say. It was the Lord's will that his gifts should remain with us, and that we who have been redeemed by his precious blood should constantly be sanctified according to the pattern of his own passion. And so he commanded those faithful disciples of his, whom he made the first priests of his church, to enact these mysteries of eternal life continuously. All priests throughout the churches of the world must celebrate these mysteries until Christ comes again from heaven. Therefore, let us all, priests and people alike, be faithful to this everlasting memorial of our redemption. He is speaking specifically of the Eucharist, first and foremost. And he, especially before and after, he talks about the body and blood of Christ and how we receive it. But this was something that every priest, every religious throughout the world, they began their day, or for those in later time zones, are about to begin their day, praying those words, which is very much the theme of this unit. We desire, as members of the church, to continuously be purified, continuously be sanctified by God. And so we have priests from God. God has entrusted priests with this ministry. And as we've also said, he has entrusted vowed religious to pray for us and to constantly be offering prayers and other supplications on our behalf. So up to this point, we've seen the ancient inspirations and the monastic beginnings of religious life, and the ways in which in the Middle Ages the mendicant orders began to rise. Let's now start to take a look at the Council of Trent, the time around the Reformation, and see the orders that resulted in the time of the Reformation as we continue our look at religious life. Around the 1500s, a number of reforms began to be instituted in various orders, and orders arose in order to meet the new challenges of the Protestant Reformation. So that in the 16th century, this is when the Jesuits come onto the scene, as well as other active orders. So we see here with the Jesuits, when we look at the Jesuits, and here is myself and 2 Jesuit priests. At the time I was still a scholastic. This was in my regency at in the school chapel in Tampa. One of the things you'll notice, as we've been seeing the habits of religious orders, usually they look very distinct. You have the brown of the Franciscans, the brown and tan of the Carmelites, the black and white of the Dominicans, the flowing black monastic robes of the Benedictines. The Jesuits, as you can see, the Jesuit habit looks very much like a regular diocesan cassock. And you can see as I'm wearing my Jesuit cassock right now, it's basically a streamlined version of the diocesan cassock. The diocesan cassock has 33 buttons down the front, one for each year of the life of Christ. And on the sleeves, there's 5 buttons on each sleeve to represent the 5 wounds of Christ. You see none of that on the Jesuit cassock, and this is with good reason. And in fact, if you take a look, so you're probably also all familiar with the biretta, the distinctive kind of pom-pom, the distinctive hat that priests wear, usually has a pom-pom on top. This is the Jesuit biretta. So you've probably seen images of St. Ignatius wearing this beretta, wearing something like this, you'll notice, again, it's also much simpler. There's no pom-pom on top. And actually, it's kind of nice also. That makes it for easy travel. I can push down there, boom, put it in my suitcase. And now it's ready for regular wear. But this was very much by design, because what Ignatius wanted in creating a habit, in creating a way of dress that's similar to the diocesan priesthood, Ignatius wanted something that would remind people of ordinary priests, except be a little more streamlined, be a little more simplified for the sake of a religious order. Religious orders, Ignatius thought, shouldn't have quite so many bells and whistles as regular priests, but he still wanted us to be reminiscent of them, so that the idea of the priest would be rehabilitated in the minds of so many who were used to seeing priests of maybe less than sterile morals. And in fact, before the name Jesuit really took off as the name for the Jesuit order, people simply started calling us Reformed priests. And so the idea took off. And this is you're going to see this a lot with other orders as well that are formed after this. They're going to try and graft themselves onto existing structures and say, how can we resemble what people already know? How can we have attire that looks similar to what people already experienced? But in wearing this, in going about this, we're going to maybe rehabilitate the image a little bit. So that's going to be one difference that you're going to see with these new active orders, because they are much more explicitly designed to go out and rehabilitate the church and rehabilitate some of the corruption that has been noticed within the church. One of the other orders that did this alongside the Jesuits was the Theatines. And there you have St. Cajetan, the founder of the Theatines. At the time, so the Theatines really focused on evangelization, on preaching to people and on winning souls back for Christ, reminding people why it was that the Catholic Church was able to bring about their sanctification. At the time, the Theatines were seen as being the rivals to the Jesuits. Everybody said, oh, the Jesuits and the Theatines, those are the next big things. We were founded more or less around the same time, had similar missions. These days, the Theatines have about 300 priests scattered throughout the world. The Jesuits have 15,000. They tried. They tried. But we do appreciate their work of evangelization and their role in the Counter-Reformation in the 1500s. And so Ignatius, of course, he creates the Jesuits as a way of simply being at the service of the church, purely active. He wants us to be living on alms like Dominicans and like Franciscans, but Ignatius presents himself before the Holy Father and says, what is it that you need me to do? What is it that you need the church to do? What do you need us to do within the church? We will go and do that. The Jesuits were fundamentally founded as an order of missionaries. After this, you have also a second round of reforms in many orders. The Carmelites, for instance, you have the Discalced Carmelites around 1562. You have Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. In the 1200s, after the Carmelites' initial founding, later on in the 1300s and in the 1400s, certain elements of the Carmelite rule began to be relaxed. Rules about fasting, about the penances, all the rest. And unfortunately, the impression began to rise that the Carmelites had started to lose their way, that when these penances became a little bit more relaxed, anybody started becoming a Carmelite, and it no longer was that life focused on contemplation. They were a mendicant order, but they were also a contemplative order, unlike the Dominicans and the Franciscans, who were active mendicant orders. And so what Teresa of Avila and what John of the Cross desired to do was to bring the Carmelites back to their roots. Discalced, by the way, refers to going shoeless. Specifically, usually discalced Carmelites will wear sandals or something else instead of shoes. This was just one indication of the fanciness to which the Carmelites had grown. The Augustinians likewise developed a discalced order several other groups had movements along these lines, where in the 1500s, individuals looked at their orders and said, we should probably change this. We should get back to our roots. We should go back to a stricter observance of how things were in the beginning. We seem to have lost our way. This was also the case, more or less, with groups like the Capuchin Franciscans. And we see here an example of the Capuchin Franciscans. So there are various forms of Franciscans. The Capuchins tend to live, again, a very strict form of poverty, a much stricter form of penance. And the Capuchins are still to this day a really wonderful order of Franciscans, wonderful order that exists throughout the church, doing really tremendous work. All of these orders are mirroring the general movements that they see in the church and saying, just as the church needs to reform, so too some of our orders may have lost our way, or in the case of groups like Jesuits or the Theatines, saying, we want to create a new order, one that will hopefully avoid some of the stumbling blocks that some of the other orders encountered. This is why, for instance, Ignatius, following on the pattern of Dominic, wanted to have Jesuits be very well educated, learned priests who could be at the service of the church and could do whatever it was that needed doing within the church. And so we have new groups arising as well as reformations of older groups in around the 1500s. After Trent, you have not orders springing up, but now you have what are called congregations. So the Congregation of the Holy Cross, for instance, runs Holy Cross High School here and also University of Notre Dame, places like that. After Trent, orders are no longer founded. Now what are being founded are called congregations. The difference is actually somewhat important. With orders, you're going to have, one of the major differences is that an order is going to have solemn vows. When you finish your formation, you will take solemn vows at the end. So you all remember last year at the beginning of May at the school mass, Father Brown made his solemn vows. He made his final vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and special obedience with regards to the missions to the Holy Father. Those were solemn vows. And solemn vows, essentially, once you've made solemn vows, only the Pope himself can release you. So if someday, if a Jesuit takes solemn vows and says, I don't want to be a Jesuit anymore, only the Pope can dismiss an individual from solemn vows. Congregations tend to take simple vows. Simple vows are much easier to be released. And there's a reason for this. The reason is orders were multiplying at a much faster rate or congregations rather, were multiplying at a much faster rate than orders were. There's a reason why for the first 1500 years or so, like, okay, we've got these 5 orders, and then in the 1200s, we've got another 5 orders. Once the 1500s hit, you have a lot of congregations springing up. And so you want things to be maybe a little bit more flexible, and only having simple vows is going to allow for that flexibility. Because congregations tended to be geared towards specific goals in ministry, especially in social service, education, and evangelization. Whereas orders are about living a particular way of life. So the Benedictines aren't going to say, hey, we want to found an order for education. Benedict says, I want people to learn how to pray in a certain way. Ignatius is going to say, I have a certain way of praying, and I want us to be at the general service of the church. Dominic is going to say, I want us to have a certain way of praying, and we will generally preach. But it's not like Dominicans are mainly geared towards education. You have Dominicans in the pastoral ministry, you have Dominicans giving retreats, Dominicans who are running universities, high schools. There's all sorts of things. Congregations tend to be very, very specific. For instance, the Ursulines came about around the 1500s. The Ursulines were founded specifically for the education of young girls. No order had specifically been founded for the education of girls before. First of all, no order had been founded specifically for education before. Remember, as much as you may associate the Jesuits with education, we are not only about running schools. You have the parish down at Barone Street, you have the retreat house in Manresa, you have universities, you have all sorts of things beyond simply running schools. The Ursulines really were one of the first groups that said, we want to establish schools. And because women's groups and women's branches within an order still tended to live within monasteries, being a congregation having simple vows gave the Ursulines a little bit more freedom. They were not bound to be within a monastery, and so they could go out, they could educate the young girls, they could do what it was that they needed to do. Other congregations that have been founded in the wake of this, you have groups like the Oratorians. St. Philip Neri, the Congregation of the Oratory, is St. Philip Neri, who was actually a very good friend of St. Ignatius. They both lived in Rome together. They were running their respective orders in Rome together. It was often said they would take evening walks together. It was often said that the streets of Rome would be filled with the laughter of Philip and Ignatius as they would tell jokes to one another and enjoy one another's company. St. Philip Neri founded the Oratorians, and they were founded as groups of priests so that priests could live a diocesan life, but maybe be a little bit more organized. So the congregation of the Oratory, and they would be geared towards giving, preaching sermons and giving other retreats. But he didn't want them to be living mendicant lives. He didn't want them to be living monastic lives. So he said, we're just going to give them simple vows. They'll live together. It'll be kind of a loose association, nothing too strict. And individuals like Cardinal Newman are very well known, are some of the more famous Oratorians. You have individuals like Vincent de Paul with the Vincentians, both the Vincentian brothers and the Vincentian sisters, or as they're known usually in Europe, the Lazarists. St. Vincent de Paul wanted an order, wanted a congregation that was very flexible and was dedicated specifically towards the aid of the poor. Francis of Assisi, aiding the poor and being with the poor was a major part of what they did, but it was not only what they did. St. Bonaventure, for instance, was a Franciscan priest and was a dear friend of St. Thomas Aquinas's, and he taught at the University of Paris alongside Thomas Aquinas. So even the Franciscans, you had a particular way of life, and you might tend to do certain things, but it was not only about doing those certain things, where if you join the Vincentians, you are doing social work, you are doing service to the poor. Wonderful work, but congregations are much more narrow in their focus than orders. Orders are like paratroopers. Drop me in wherever you need them. Congregations have a much more specifically focused mission. You have groups like the Samoskans and the Salesians. The Salesians of St. John Bosco are, and the Samoskans, both orders that take their inspiration from Don Bosco. Don Bosco, again, he founds an order specifically to help orphans and to help for the ministry of youth. Jesuits, again, we're not dedicated only towards youth. There are Jesuits who work primarily with older groups. And so the Salesians and other groups like those are geared primarily towards that specific thing. Other groups such as Josephites, which came about in the 1800s, as well as the Salesians. Salesians and Josephites were both groups that came about in the 1800s. The Josephites, of course, as we know from places like St. Auguste, are primarily geared towards ministering to the African American population. So that's even more specific, not just a specific group of individuals, but a specific racial group within a specific nation. So the Josephites tend to focus on African American ministry, and so getting even more specific. Very necessary work, very good work. And so the Josephites realize, hey, with broader orders, they aren't necessarily able to handle all of these things. We need to plug this specific gap. And so this is why you have the rise of congregations after Trent. Not only because the church realized we probably have enough orders, we probably have enough groups doing it with solemn vows. Let's have groups that are now maybe a little bit more, even more nimble than the Jesuits, and can be, if need be, a little more easily released from their obligations. The obligations aren't as strict and much more easy to be released from. So this is religious life as it has developed in the church today. You have various mendicant orders, you have monastic orders, you have the active orders, then you have the rise of the congregations in the church after Trent. What we're going to do tomorrow is we're going to see how all of this looks today. What is the state of religious life today? All of these orders, all of these groups, orders, congregations, societies of apostolic life, lay associations, we're going to talk about what that means tomorrow, all of them still play an absolutely vital role in the church today. What I don't want you leaving here thinking is, oh, well, the monastic orders were fine in the 400s, but we have different needs now. The mendicants were fine back then, but we have different needs now. The religious life is still a very necessary part of the church today, and religious life in all forms, and can continue to inspire us. One of the things that I'm going to have in the description below is the ending scene from an opera that was written in the 20th century called Dialogues des Carmélites, the Dialogues of the Carmelites. And it's an opera written in French. It's about the Carmelite martyrs of Compiègne. During the French Revolution, many clergy were guillotined, whether or not they were guilty of any crimes. It wasn't just corrupt kings and dukes and whatnot. And it wasn't even just corrupt priests and bishops. The French Revolution really went after everybody. And that included a group of Carmelite sisters, Carmelite nuns, and they did live in a monastery, Carmelite nuns in their monastery in Compiègne. In the mid-20th century, an opera was written to commemorate this. And at the very end, and so the sisters, it's based on the true story of the martyrs of Compiègne. At the very end, they are singing the Salve Regina. And one by one, the sisters are led to the guillotine so that you start with 13, then 12 voices, 11, and the songs get fainter. And then at the end, you start to think, oh, who will continue to sing the song? And then at the very end, a young novice who had fled the order in fear when it seemed like everything was going downhill, she returns to the sisters and she continues to sing, and she sings the final verse of the Veni Creator Spiritus, which you sing at your vows traditionally. And it's this, that particular verse is a verse of giving one's whole life to God. And she too then is martyred. We hear the guillotine and her voice is silenced as well. And with that, we are left with a very still, solemn injunction to continue on the song of the Carmelites, join in this great opera, join in the dialogue of the Carmelites. Even in the 20th century, the example of these 17th century, or these 18th century rather, Carmelite martyrs, they continue to inspire us. Religious life of all forms is truly a wonderful treasure, a wonderful gift to the church, and one that I hope you will explore, and one that you will see the benefits from in your own life as you go throughout your own lives and as you continue to develop your own lives of prayer, which will very much be the focus of our next and final new material that we're going to be covering, religious life in the church today. Have a good day, gentlemen. Stay well.